September 13, 1942. Western outskirts of Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed his body against the still-warm rubble of what had been a tractor factory's outer wall, the Kar-98K rifle heavy in his hands. Smoke from 1,000 fires turned the afternoon sky the color of old brass, and the Volga River beyond the city shimmered like molten copper through the haze. The air tasted of cordite, burning oil, and something else, something organic and terrible that Hartmann had learned not to think about too carefully. "Look at this place," muttered Gefreiter Otto Beck, crouched beside him, wiping dust from his eyes with a dirt-blackened hand. "The Ivans are finished. Another week, maybe two, and we'll be drinking vodka on the Volga." Hartmann nodded, though something in his gut twisted uneasily. They'd been saying that for 3 weeks now, ever since General Paulus's Sixth Army had smashed through the Soviet outer defenses and driven toward the city proper. The Luftwaffe's bombers had turned most of Stalingrad into a moonscape of craters and skeletal buildings on August 23, killing thousands of civilians in a single afternoon. The Soviet defenders should have broken. They should have run. Instead, they stayed. Around Hartmann, the men of his company, veterans of the stunning victories in France, the lightning advances through Ukraine, the capture of Kiev, carried themselves with the casual confidence of soldiers who had never truly been stopped. Their uniforms were dusty, their faces lean and tanned from 2 years of campaigning, but their eyes held the steady certainty of men who had seen enemy armies crumble before them again and again. "Remember those Russian prisoners we passed yesterday?" Beck continued, checking the ammunition in his MP40's magazine. "Peasants in uniforms. Half of them didn't even have proper boots. And these are the men who are supposed to stop the Wehrmacht." The sentiment wasn't unique to Beck. Throughout the Sixth Army, from the privates in the infantry to the officers planning operations from their command posts, a pervasive certainty had taken hold: the Red Army was finished as a fighting force. The catastrophic defeats of 1941, the encirclements at Kiev, Minsk, and Vyazma that had netted hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners, had seemingly proven that the Russians, for all their numbers, lacked the skill, equipment, and will to stand against German military might. The soldiers called them Ivans with contempt. They told jokes about Russian tanks that fell apart on the march, about commissars who had to threaten their own men with pistols to make them fight, about entire Soviet divisions that surrendered at the first sight of German armor. The racist ideology of National Socialism reinforced this contempt with pseudoscientific certainty. The Slavs were to mention subhumans genetically inferior to the Germanic master race, incapable of matching German discipline and martial prowess. Hauptmann Friedrich Wiener, commander of their company, moved along the line of men with the easy stride of an officer who had led his troops through every major campaign since Poland. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and the Iron Cross First Class on his tunic earned at Smolensk the previous year. When he reached Hartmann's position, he knelt beside them, studying the ruins ahead through his binoculars. "The latest intelligence reports are clear," Wiener said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of Prussian military tradition. "The Soviet 62nd Army is isolated. They have the Volga at their backs, no room to retreat, and we control most of the city center. General Chuikov, their commander, is trapped. It's only a matter of time before organized resistance collapses." "How long, Herr Hauptmann?" Hartmann asked. Wiener lowered his binoculars, a slight smile touching his lips. "General Paulus estimates 10 days to 2 weeks for complete pacification. The Führer wants the city taken before winter, and we will deliver it to him. We've faced the Red Army before, gentlemen. We know what they're capable of and what they're not." It was a sentiment that echoed throughout the German command structure. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, was confident that Stalingrad would fall quickly once his forces penetrated the city's defenses. The city stretched for nearly 30 miles along the Volga's western bank, but was rarely more than 2 or 3 miles deep, a narrow strip of urban terrain that seemed inherently vulnerable to the kind of aggressive, mobile warfare at which the Wehrmacht excelled. The Luftwaffe had already done its work. On that terrible day in late August, hundreds of bombers had swept across Stalingrad in waves, dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs that had killed an estimated 40,000 civilians and turned the city into an inferno. Wooden buildings had burned like kindling. Oil storage tanks had exploded, sending rivers of flame through the streets. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to charred ruins and ash. Surely, German officers reasoned, No defending force could maintain cohesion and morale in such devastation. The Soviets would fight for a few days, perhaps a week, and then the survivors would surrender or flee across the Volga. It was what had happened before, in city after city, as the Wehrmacht had driven eastward through the Soviet Union. But Stalingrad was different, though the Germans didn't fully understand that yet. The city wasn't just a collection of buildings and streets. It bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Stalin's city, and its loss would represent not just a military disaster but a profound symbolic defeat. Stalin had issued Order 227 in July, not one step back. Soldiers who retreated without orders were to be shot. Special blocking detachments had been formed, positioned behind the front lines with machine guns, ready to cut down any man who tried to flee. It was brutal, draconian, and by the standards of Western military tradition, barbaric. But it was also effective. The Soviet 62nd Army, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, was not like the demoralized, poorly-led formations the Germans had shattered in 1941. Chuikov was a hard man, a veteran of the Russian Civil War who understood urban combat and had no illusions about the horror ahead. When he had taken command on September 12, just one day before Hartmann and his comrades prepared to push deeper into the city, he had immediately implemented a new tactical doctrine: hug the enemy. Instead of defending from fixed positions where German artillery and air superiority could annihilate them, Soviet troops were ordered to get as close to the German lines as possible, sometimes just 30 or 40 meters away. This negated the Germans' advantage in supporting fires. Luftwaffe bombers and Wehrmacht artillery couldn't strike Soviet positions without hitting their own men. The fighting would have to be done at close range, building by building, room by room, where numbers and fanatical determination could offset German tactical superiority. But Klaus Hartmann didn't know any of this as he checked his rifle and prepared to advance. He was 23 years old, a farmer's son from Bavaria who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, dreaming of glory and adventure. He'd found both, in a way, but also things he hadn't expected: exhaustion, fear, and the grinding reality that modern warfare was less about heroic charges and more about survival, luck, and the small, brutal mathematics of who shot first. "All right, men," Hauptmann Wiener called out, standing and drawing his Luger pistol. "We advance in 5 minutes. Same as always, fire and movement. Stay low, watch for snipers. The Stukas have hit the Russian positions ahead, so most of their defenses should be neutralized. We push through to the railway station and secure it by nightfall." Questions? No one spoke. They'd done this dozens of times before. Hartmann tightened the straps on his equipment, feeling the familiar weight of his ammunition pouches, grenades, and entrenching tool. Beside him, Beck was muttering a prayer Otto always prayed before combat, though he claimed not to believe in God anymore. The other men in the squad went through their own rituals, checking weapons, adjusting helmets, sharing cigarettes in quick, nervous puffs. To their right, a Panzer IV rumbled past, its commander standing in the turret hatch, surveying the ruins ahead. The tank's grey paint was thick with dust, and someone had chalked Vernichter, destroyer, on the turret side. The commander, a lieutenant whose name Hartmann didn't know, looked bored, as if this were just another day's work. The artillery barrage began at precisely 2 p.m. hours. German 105mm and 150mm howitzers, positioned in the suburbs and outskirts, opened up with a sustained bombardment that made the ground shake and sent geysers of smoke and debris erupting from the buildings ahead. The sound was immense, a continuous rolling thunder that made conversation impossible. Hartmann felt it in his chest, in his bones, a physical pressure that turned the world into nothing but noise and violence. For 15 minutes, the barrage continued. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence afterward was almost worse than the noise. "Move out!" Wiener shouted, his voice hoarse. "Advance!" Hartmann rose from cover and began moving forward with his squad, boots crunching on rubble and broken glass. The ruins of Stalingrad stretched before the main nightmare landscape of collapsed walls, twisted metal, and craters that still smoked from the artillery impacts. Buildings that had once been apartments, shops, and offices now stood as hollow shells, their windows empty and black like the eye sockets of skulls. They moved in the practiced formations of experienced infantry, squads spread out, covering each other's advance, rifles and submachine guns at the ready. The Panzer IV crawled forward alongside them, its 75mm gun traversing slowly, searching for targets. "Remember," Otto muttered as they advanced, "the Russians can't shoot straight. They never could. We've proved that from Moscow to here. Just keep your head down and dash." The machine gun opened up from a third-story window 50 meters ahead. The milligram 34's distinctive high-pitched burr cut through the air, and suddenly the world exploded into chaos. Bullets cracked past Hartmann's head, whining off rubble and sparking against stone. He threw himself down behind a pile of broken bricks as men around him scattered for cover. "Contact front," someone screamed. The Panzer IV's turret swung toward the machine gun position, and its main gun fired with a flat, brutal crack. The shell hit the building's facade, blowing out a chunk of wall in a cloud of dust and fire. For a moment, the machine gun fell silent. Then it started firing again, from a different window. "Scheiße!" Beck cursed, pressed flat beside Hartmann. "They're moving position." More gunfire erupted, rifles this time, multiple shooters, from buildings on both sides of the street. Hartmann caught a glimpse of a figure in a khaki uniform darting between windows on the second floor of a bombed-out apartment block. He raised his Kar 98K, aimed, fired. The recoil kicked against his shoulder. He didn't know if he hit anything. Grenades. Wiener was shouting. "Suppress that machine gun. Second squad. Flank left. Move, move." The battle devolved into the chaotic, close-range violence that would define Stalingrad. German troops fired at muzzle flashes, charged across open ground toward buildings, threw grenades through windows. The Panzer IV fired again and again, each shot creating momentary advantages that infantry squads tried to exploit. Soviet defenders fired back with rifles, machine guns, and their own grenades, and the smoke from explosions and fires grew so thick that visibility dropped to just meters. Hartmann found himself running, always running from cover to cover, firing when he saw targets, reloading without thinking, his training taking over. He saw a German soldier go down, clutching his leg, screaming. He saw Otto Beck throw a grenade through a doorway and then duck as the explosion sent shrapnel rattling against the wall. He saw the Panzer IV take a direct hit from something, an anti-tank rifle or a hidden gun, and lurch to a stop, smoke pouring from its engine deck. And through it all, the Soviet defenders kept fighting. They didn't break. They didn't run. They fought from every room, every floor, every pile of rubble. When one position was overrun, they fell back to another and kept firing. When they ran out of ammunition, they used whatever was at hand: improvised explosives, sharpened stakes, even rubble thrown from upper floors. It took 3 hours to advance 200 meters. When night finally fell and Hauptmann Wiener ordered his battered company to consolidate their positions, they had captured half a block of ruins and lost 14 men. The railway station, their objective, was still 500 meters away, held by Soviet troops who showed no sign of yielding. Hartmann sat in what had been someone's kitchen, his back against a wall pockmarked with bullet holes, and stared at nothing. His hands were shaking. Otto Beck sat beside him, equally silent. Around them, the other survivors of the day's fighting tended wounds, ate cold rations, and tried to process what had just happened. "They fought like animals," someone whispered in the darkness. "Like cornered rats." 10 days, another man said, his voice hollow. The Hauptmann said 10 days to take the city. No one responded to that. They all knew the truth now, even if they couldn't yet articulate it. The war they had known, the war of rapid advances and decisive victories, of enemies who broke and fled, was over. A new kind of war had begun in the ruins of Stalingrad, and it would be worse than anything they had imagined. In the darkness, somewhere across the shattered landscape, a Soviet soldier began singing. The melody was haunting, defiant, carrying across the ruins like a challenge or a promise. Klaus Hartmann closed his eyes and tried not to think about tomorrow. September 20th, 1942. Stalingrad, one railway station. 7 days later. The station had changed hands 4 times in 6 days. Hartmann crouched behind an overturned locomotive that lay on its side like a dead beast, its boiler ruptured and cold. The great terminal building loomed above him, once a monument to Soviet industrial progress with its grand archways and hammer and sickle reliefs, now a gutted shell where every window had become a firing position and every wall bore the scars of countless explosions. The morning sun barely penetrated the pall of smoke that hung over everything, turning the light grey and weak. His uniform was no longer the crisp field grey of a week ago. It was stained with oil, blood, some his own from a shrapnel cut across his forearm, most from other men, and the omnipresent dust that got into everything: eyes, mouth, rifle mechanisms, wounds. He'd stopped counting the hours since he'd last slept properly. 2 days? 3. Water, croaked Gefreiter Beck beside him, holding out a canteen with a trembling hand. Hartmann took it, drank sparingly. The water tasted of metal and chemicals. Everything tasted of chemicals now. They'd taken the station on the 15th, lost it on the 16th, retaken it on the 17th, lost it again on the 18th. Yesterday they'd fought for 6 hours to capture the main terminal building, clearing it room by room with grenades and close-range automatic fire, stepping over bodies, German and Soviet alike, that had been lying in the same positions for days, in various states of decomposition. Hartmann had vomited twice, not from fear but from the smell. And now, this morning, Soviet troops were counterattacking again. "Here they come," someone shouted from the left flank. Hartmann raised his head cautiously above the locomotive's bulk and felt his stomach tighten. Across the railway yards, emerging from the ruins of a bombed-out freight depot, came Soviet infantry. Not in the parade ground formations that German propaganda films had mocked, but in small groups, using cover expertly, moving with the efficiency of men who had learned their lessons in blood. They wore an odd mixture of uniforms, some in standard Red Army khaki, others in workers' clothing with only a belt and rifle to mark them as soldiers. Many had no helmets. But they moved with purpose, and their rifles were very much real. Fire at will. Hauptmann Wiener's voice rang out from somewhere to Hartmann's right. The Hauptmann was still alive, though a bandage covered half his face from a grenade fragment 2 days ago, and he'd stopped smiling entirely. The German defensive line erupted in fire. Hartmann aimed at a Soviet soldier running between 2 wrecked railway cars and squeezed the trigger. The Kar 98K bucked against his shoulder. The Russian went down, whether from his shot or someone else's. Hartmann couldn't tell and no longer cared. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering another round, aimed again, fired again. The milligram 42 positioned in the ticket office. They dragged it up there yesterday, replacing the milligram 34 that had been destroyed, opened up with its terrifying rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute that sounded like tearing cloth amplified 1,000 times. Tracers arced across the yards, and Hartmann saw Soviet soldiers throwing themselves down, seeking whatever cover they could find. But they didn't retreat. They never retreated. Instead, they returned fire, and suddenly the air was full of bullets. The locomotive shuddered as rounds sparked off its iron hide. Hartmann pressed himself lower, working his rifle's bolt mechanically, firing whenever he saw movement, no longer thinking, just reacting. A Soviet soldier made it to within 30 meters. A woman, Hartmann realized with shock, her hair tied back, a PP-41 submachine gun in her hands. She fired a burst that sent Beck scrambling backward with a curse. Hartmann put his sights on her center mass and pulled the trigger. She crumpled. Grenade. Otto screamed. The stick grenade tumbled through the air, thrown from somewhere in the Soviet lines. It landed 5 meters away. Hartmann had just enough time to register its presence before it detonated with a flat crack that sent shrapnel whining past his head and made his ears ring. When he looked up, blood was running down Otto's face from a cut above his eye, but his friend was still moving, still alive, still firing. The Soviet attack lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the Russians fell back, not in panicked rout but in good order, carrying their wounded, leaving only their dead behind. The Germans held the station. Again. For now. Lieutenant Hans Kohler, who had taken command of 2nd Platoon after its previous commander had been killed on the 16th, came walking down the line, checking casualties. He was younger than Hartmann, a recent officer candidate who'd been given his commission in the field. His eyes had the same hollow look they all had now. "Ammunition count," he said, his voice flat. "Report." Hartmann checked his pouches. 20 rounds, Herr Leutnant. 2 grenades. "I have 30 rounds, Beck said. 1 grenade. It was the same all down the line. They were running low on everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, men. The supply lines were supposed to keep them equipped, but the Soviet artillery across the Volga ferries, as the Germans had begun calling them bitterly, made it difficult and dangerous to bring supplies forward. And the fighting consumed everything so quickly. A day's worth of ammunition could be expended in an hour's battle. Resupply comes tonight, Koller said, though he didn't sound convinced. Hold position until then. Stay alert. They'll be back. He was right. They would be back. They always came back. Hartmann slumped against the locomotive and closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them again, the sun had moved noticeably in the sky. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, rifle across his lap. Otto was staring at him with an expression Hartmann couldn't quite read. "You were mumbling," Otto said. "About home. About the farm." "How long was I out?" 20 minutes. I let you sleep. Someone should get to sleep. You should sleep too." "Can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The Russians. The dead ones. The ones in the basement yesterday." Otto's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Hans, you know, from 3rd Squad, he told me that when they cleared the hospital 2 days ago, they found Soviet wounded who fought them with scalpels and bedpans. Wounded men. Some with one leg. And they fought." Hartmann didn't respond. What could he say? The hospital had been particularly bad. It had taken an entire company 12 hours to secure a single building. The Soviet defenders, a mixture of Red Army soldiers, armed civilians, and even patients, had contested every floor, every room, every corridor. They'd barricaded stairwells and filled them with improvised explosives. They'd turned operating theaters into machine gun nests. When German pioneers had finally blown a hole in the basement wall with demolition charges, they'd found Soviet soldiers waiting with grenades in hand, ready to die, taking Germans with them. "We were told they'd break," Otto continued, his voice taking on a strange, detached quality. "Remember? Back in training, the instructors told us the Slavs were inferior. Cowards. That they'd run when we showed them German steel. I remember. They lied to us, Klaus. Or they were wrong. I don't know which is worse." Before Hartmann could respond, the shelling began. Soviet artillery 122 mm howitzers positioned on the eastern bank of the Volga, beyond the reach of German counter-battery fire, opened up on the railway station. The first shell hit the main terminal building, blowing out what remained of its southern wall in a cascade of rubble. The second landed in the rail yard, creating a crater that swallowed 2 bodies that had been lying there since yesterday. "Cover!" Hartmann yelled unnecessarily. Everyone was already scrambling for whatever protection they could find. The barrage was methodical, systematic, designed not just to kill but to pulverize, to turn stone into dust and steel into fragments. Hartmann pressed himself into a narrow gap between the locomotive and a concrete platform, making himself as small as possible, hands over his head as the world shook apart around him. The noise was beyond description, a continuous roar that obliterated thought, that reduced existence to simple survival from one second to the next. A shell landed close enough that the blast wave picked Hartmann up and slammed him against the concrete. His helmet rang like a bell. His vision went white, then dark, then slowly came back in stages. Blood was running from his nose. His ears felt like they'd been stuffed with cotton. Through the ringing in his head, he heard screaming. When the barrage finally lifted 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, Hartmann crawled out of his shelter to find the defensive position transformed. The locomotive that had protected him now had a massive dent in its side. The ticket office where the milligram 42 had been positioned was simply gone, replaced by a smoking crater. Bodies or parts of bodies lay scattered across the platform. "Medic!" someone was shouting. "Medic! Sanitator!" Obergefreiter Werner Haas, the company's senior medic, was already moving among the wounded with his aid bag, but Hartmann could see the despair in his movements. There were too many wounded, too few medical supplies, and some injuries were beyond even morphine and bandages to address. Otto Beck was sitting up, dazed but apparently unhurt beyond a new collection of small cuts. Lieutenant Koller was shouting orders, trying to reorganize the defenses, but his voice sounded distant and strange through Hartmann's damaged hearing. And then the Soviet infantry came again. They emerged from the smoke like ghosts, moving fast, exploiting the chaos and confusion of the barrage. This time they weren't attacking in small groups but in company strength, perhaps 200 soldiers, all focused on the railway station, committed to taking it back regardless of cost. The Germans opened fire, but their response was ragged, disorganized. Half the milligram, 42 positions, had been destroyed in the shelling. Ammunition was critically low. Men who'd been on edge for 6 days straight moved sluggishly, their reactions slowed by exhaustion and shock. Hartmann fired until his rifle was empty, then scrambled to reload with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. A Soviet soldier appeared on top of the locomotive. How had he gotten there so fast? And aimed a rifle down at him. Hartmann threw himself sideways as the shot cracked past his head, rolled, came up with his rifle halfway to his shoulder, fired. The Russian fell backward off the locomotive. Close combat broke out across the position. German soldiers fought with rifles, pistols, entrenching tools, fists, whatever they had. The Soviets did the same. Hartmann found himself in a desperate struggle with a Russian soldier who'd come at him with a bayonet. They grappled, rolled across rubble-strewn ground, and Hartmann got his hands on the man's throat and squeezed until the Soviet struggles weakened and stopped. He stood up, gasping, covered in blood. The Russians, he couldn't tell, and saw Otto Beck locked in combat with 2 Soviet soldiers. Hartmann charged, swinging his rifle like a club, and heard something crack when the wooden stock connected with a Russian helmet. The second Soviet turned toward him, but Otto was faster, driving his bayonet into the man's side. "Fall back!" Hauptmann Wiener was shouting. "Fall back to the secondary position. Move!" The retreat was controlled but desperate. German soldiers pulled back from the station through streets they'd fought to take just days before, laying down covering fire, dragging wounded with them when they could. The Soviets pressed them hard, giving no quarter, accepting horrific casualties to drive the Germans back another 100 meters, another 50 meters. By the time they established a new defensive line in the ruins of an apartment complex 2 blocks south of the station, it was mid-afternoon. They'd lost the railway station again. And they'd lost 40 men killed, wounded, or simply missing in the chaos. Hartmann sat with his back against a wall and stared at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. Beside him, Otto Beck was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "I killed a man with my bare hands today," Otto whispered. "Strangled him. Watched him die." "I know," Hartmann said. "I did too." That night, Hauptmann Wiener called together what remained of his company's NCOs and squad leaders. Hartmann, as senior soldier in his squad after the death of their Unteroffizier 3 days ago, attended. They gathered in a basement that still had most of its ceiling, lit by a single kerosene lantern that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Wiener's face, illuminated by the flickering light, looked like it belonged to a man 20 years older than he was. The bandage on his head was stained with old blood, and his hands trembled slightly when he spread a map across an improvised table made from a door laid across 2 crates. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders all day, "I've just come from battalion headquarters. The situation is as follows. The 6th Army has committed 9 divisions to taking Stalingrad. We control approximately 70% of the city. Soviet forces are compressed into a strip barely a kilometer deep along the Volga." He paused, and everyone in that basement knew what he wasn't saying. That 70% of the city meant 70% of ruins. That controlling shattered buildings meant nothing when the enemy could infiltrate through saws and subway tunnels. That compressing the Soviet forces hadn't broken them but rather made them fight harder. "General Paulus has ordered renewed offensives," Wiener continued. "We are to recapture the railway station, secure Mamaev-Kurgan," he pointed to the map, indicating a hill that dominated the city, and drive the remaining Soviet forces into the Volga. "The attack begins at dawn." No one spoke. No one asked questions. They all knew the real question, and none of them wanted to voice it. How many of us will still be alive tomorrow night? "I won't lie to you," Wiener said quietly. "This is unlike anything we've faced before. The enemy fights with a determination that defies military logic. They suffer casualties that should break any army, and they keep coming. They've turned this city into a fortress where conventional tactics are almost useless." Unteroffizier Paul Richter, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, finally spoke up. "Herr Hauptmann, permission to speak freely." "Granted. The men are saying we were wrong about the Russians. That we underestimated them. Wiener's jaw tightened. The men are correct, Unteroffizier. We did underestimate them. We thought they would fight like the armies we defeated in 1941. They're not. They've learned. They've adapted. And they're fighting for their city with a fanaticism that borders on. He trailed off, searching for the word. Inhuman. But effective. Hartmann thought about the Soviet soldier he'd killed with his bare hands. About the woman with the submachine gun. About the wounded patients fighting with scalpels. Were they inhuman? Or were they more human than anyone had expected, fighting with every ounce of strength and will because they had nothing left to lose? Rest while you can, Wiener concluded. Ammunition resupply should arrive within the hour. We attack at 6 o'clock. Dismissed. The meeting broke up. As Hartmann climbed the stairs back to his squad's position, he passed a group of newer replacements men who'd arrived just 3 days ago from training depots in Germany. They looked terrified, and with good reason. The replacement rate was staggering. Some men lasted hours in Stalingrad. The veterans could identify the new soldiers instantly. They were the ones whose uniforms weren't yet stained beyond recognition, whose eyes hadn't yet acquired that 1,000-yard stare. One of them, a Gefreiter who couldn't have been more than 18, grabbed Hartmann's arm as he passed. "Is it true," the boy asked, "what they're saying about the Russians? That they don't surrender? That they fight to the last man?" Hartmann looked at the boy, at his smooth face, at his wide eyes that still held the illusion that war was something glorious, and felt something break inside him. "Yes," he said simply. "It's true. But we're winning, aren't we? We control most of the city." Hartmann pulled his arm free gently. "We control rubble. They control determination. I don't know which matters more in this place." He left the boy standing there and returned to his squad's position. Otto was already asleep, rifle clutched across his chest. Hartmann sat down beside him, checked his weapon one more time, and stared out at the ruins of Stalingrad. Somewhere in the darkness, Soviet soldiers were doing the same thing, cleaning their weapons, tending their wounds, preparing for tomorrow's battle. Neither side was willing to yield. Neither side could afford to lose. The city had become a machine that consumed men and material with insatiable hunger, grinding both armies down day by day, hour by hour, building by building. And Klaus Hartmann, sitting in the ruins with his rifle and his fear, finally understood that the war he'd known was truly over. This was something new. Something terrible. And it had only just begun. September 27th, 1942. Mamaev Kurgan, Stalingrad. The hill rose 102 meters above the surrounding city, and from its summit you could see everything: the Volga snaking silver to the east, the ruins of Stalingrad spread out like a shattered chessboard, the German positions in the western suburbs, the smoke that never stopped rising. Mamaev Kurgan. The ancient Tatar burial mound that had given the hill its name. In peacetime, it had been a park where families picnicked and children played. Now it was the most contested piece of ground on earth. Klaus Hartmann pressed himself flat against the slope as Soviet machine gun fire raked the hillside above him. Dirt and stones kicked up in a line that traced death across the scarred earth, missing him by centimeters. His breath came in ragged gasps, partly from exhaustion, partly from the climb, mostly from fear that had become so familiar it was almost comfortable. They'd been trying to take this hill for 8 days. "Move!" Hauptmann Wiener shouted from somewhere below. "Use the crater! Go, go!" Hartmann scrambled forward on his belly, rifle cradled in his arms, and rolled into a shell crater halfway up the slope. Otto Beck tumbled in beside him a moment later, followed by 2 other soldiers from their squad, Gefreiter Stefan Moss and Schütze Heinrich Weber, both replacements who'd somehow survived their first week in Stalingrad. The crater was already occupied. 3 dead Soviet soldiers lay at the bottom, their bodies bloated and black with decomposition. The smell was overwhelming. Weber vomited immediately, adding to the horror. No one commented. They'd all done the same at some point. How far to the summit? Otto gasped, wiping sweat and grime from his face. Hartmann risked a glance over the crater's lip. 50 meters. Maybe 60. Might as well be 1,000. He was right. The slope between their position and the hill's crest was a killing ground, open terrain raked by Soviet machine guns, mortars, and riflemen who'd had days to register every approach, every piece of cover, every path an attacker might take. The hillside was carpeted with German dead from previous assaults, some dating back 4 days, their bodies frozen in the positions where they'd fallen, grey uniforms now crusted brown with dried blood and dirt. This was the 7th attack since dawn. The previous 6 had all failed. A whistle shrieked somewhere down the line, the signal to attack. Hartmann grabbed his rifle, checked that a round was chambered, and prepared to leave the crater's relative safety. Around him, all along the slope, German soldiers were doing the same, rising from cover to charge once more into the teeth of Soviet fire. "For Germany!" someone shouted, one of the replacement officers, his voice high and strained with false courage. Hartmann ran. Not for Germany, not for the Führer, not for any ideology or cause. He ran because Wiener had ordered it, because his comrades were running, because stopping meant dying in place rather than dying while moving forward. It was the grim mathematics of Stalingrad. You died either way, but at least running gave you the illusion of control. The Soviet defenses opened up instantly. Machine gun fire from positions Hartmann couldn't see. Rifle shots from individual soldiers hidden among the ruins at the summit. Mortars that had been pre-registered to hit the slope, their shells arriving with terrifying accuracy. The hillside erupted in fire and smoke and the screams of dying men. Weber went down 10 meters from the crater, his legs cut out from under him by a burst of machine gun fire. He lay on the slope, clutching at the shattered stumps, screaming for his mother. Hartmann kept running. There was nothing he could do. A mortar round landed directly in front of Stefan Moss, and the young Gefreiter simply ceased to exist, replaced by a red mist and scattered pieces. Hartmann felt something wet hit his face, didn't think about what it was, kept running. 20 meters from the summit. 15. The Soviet positions were close enough now that he could see individual defenders, men in khaki uniforms, firing steadily, their faces grim and focused. A grenade came tumbling down the slope. Hartmann threw himself flat as it detonated, felt shrapnel wind past overhead, scrambled back to his feet. 10 meters. Otto Beck was beside him, firing his MP-40 from the hip, the submachine gun chattering in short bursts. A Soviet soldier stood up from behind a pile of rubble, aiming a rifle. Hartmann shot him first, worked the bolt, shot another. The crest of the hill was just ahead. And then a Soviet counterattack hit them. They came boiling out of hidden positions at the summit, not just soldiers but sailors in their distinctive black uniforms, members of the Soviet naval infantry who'd been rushed to Stalingrad to reinforce the defense. They charged downhill with bayonets fixed and grenades in hand, shouting "Jura!" in voices that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. The German attack shattered like glass. Men who'd been climbing turned and ran. Officers shouted orders that no one obeyed. The careful assault formations dissolved into chaos as Germans fled back down the slope, pursued by Soviet soldiers who showed no mercy. Hartmann saw a naval infantry sailor catch a German private and drive a bayonet through his back, then pull it free and charge after another target. Fall back. Wiener was screaming. Controlled withdrawal. Fall back to the secondary line. But there was nothing controlled about it. It was a rout, plain and simple German soldiers running for their lives down a slope slippery with blood and torn earth, abandoning equipment, abandoning wounded, abandoning everything except the desperate need to escape. Hartmann ran with them. He wasn't ashamed of it anymore. Shame was a luxury for men who hadn't fought in Stalingrad. They made it back to their starting positions, the ruins of a workers' housing complex at the base of Mamayev Kurgan, and collapsed behind whatever cover they could find. Men lay gasping, some weeping, others staring at nothing with expressions of absolute exhaustion. The attack had lasted 20 minutes from start to finish. Lieutenant Kohler began counting survivors. Out of the 60 men who'd made the assault, 32 had returned. 28 casualties in 20 minutes, and they hadn't gained a single meter of ground. "Water," someone croaked. "For the love of God, water." There was no water. The supply truck that was supposed to arrive the previous night had been destroyed by Soviet artillery. They had ammunition barely, but no water, little food, and dwindling hope. Hartmann sat with his back against a wall and realized he was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down his face, cutting tracks through the dirt and powder that covered his skin. He couldn't remember when he'd last cried. Before Stalingrad, certainly. Before this place had taught him that there were worse things than death. Otto Beck slumped down beside him, and Hartmann saw that his friend's hands were shaking uncontrollably. Shell shock, the old-timers called it.
Combat fatigue.
It was becoming epidemic. Men's nerves simply couldn't sustain the constant violence, the unending noise, the daily proximity to death. "I can't do this anymore, Klaus," Otto whispered. "I can't. I just can't." "You can. You will. We both will. How many more times? How many more attacks up that goddamned hill?" Hartmann didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. They would keep attacking until they took the hill or until they were all dead. Those were the only two possibilities, and the first was looking increasingly unlikely. That night, Hauptmann Wiener called together the surviving squad leaders again. The meeting was shorter this time. Wiener's face had taken on a waxy quality, and his hands trembled when he tried to light a cigarette. It took him 3 tries to get the match to his mouth. "New orders from division," he said without preamble. "Mamave Kurgan must be taken. General Paulus has made it clear, the hill is the key to the city. Whoever controls it controls Stalingrad. We attack again at dawn." Herr Hauptmann, Unteroffizier Richter said carefully, "The men are finished. They can't dash. The men will do their duty." Wiener snapped, his voice cracking. Then, more quietly, "They must. We all must. What choice do we have?" What choice indeed? Behind them lay thousands of kilometers of occupied territory, the triumphant Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe. Before them lay a city they couldn't take and an enemy they couldn't break. Retreat was impossible not just militarily but psychologically. The German army didn't retreat. It didn't admit defeat. It kept fighting, kept attacking, kept feeding men into the meat grinder because that was what soldiers did. "There are reinforcements coming," Wiener continued, speaking more to himself than to the assembled NCOs. "Another regiment. Fresh troops. They'll tip the balance. You'll see. Just one more push. Just one more attack." Everyone in that room knew he was lying. Or perhaps he wasn't lying, perhaps he genuinely believed it. Perhaps believing it was the only way he could function, the only way any of them could function. The alternative acknowledging that they were trapped in an unwinnable battle, that the city was destroying them faster than they could destroy it, was too terrible to contemplate. The meeting dissolved. Hartmann returned to his squad's position to find that Weber had died during the afternoon, bleeding out from his leg wounds while calling for a medic who never came. They'd left him on the hillside because they couldn't carry him down during the retreat. Someone had retrieved his body after dark, probably for the identification tags and personal effects. That left 3 men in Hartmann's squad, himself, Otto, and a replacement named Fischer who'd arrived yesterday and hadn't yet spoken more than 10 words. A full squad was supposed to have 10 men. Hartmann cleaned his rifle by the light of a candle stub, the movements automatic after 3 years of military service. Strip the bolt, clean the barrel, check the sights, reassemble. The routine was comforting, a connection to a world where things made sense, where you could maintain equipment and maintain control. But his rifle couldn't tell him how to take a hill that had been taken and lost a dozen times. His rifle couldn't explain why Soviet soldiers fought with such desperate determination. His rifle couldn't answer the question that was beginning to haunt every German soldier in Stalingrad. What if we can't win? Klaus. Otto's voice came from the darkness. "You remember what we talked about? After we took Warsaw? About the war being over soon, about going home for Christmas." "I remember. That was 3 years ago." "I know. Do you think?" Otto paused, struggling with words. "Do you think we're going to die here?" Hartmann continued cleaning his rifle, not looking up. "I think we're going to fight tomorrow. That's all I know. That's all I can think about." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." They sat in silence after that. Around them, the ruins of Stalingrad stretched in every direction, a landscape of broken stone and twisted metal, of fires that burned without end, of shadows that might be buildings or might be nothing at all. The front line wasn't a line anymore, but a chaotic tangle where German and Soviet positions were sometimes separated by a single wall, where you could hear the enemy breathing on the other side of a rubble pile, where death could come from any direction at any moment. At 4 o'clock hours, they stood to for the dawn attack. The sun wouldn't rise for another hour, but they would attack in darkness, hoping to catch the Soviet defenders unprepared. It was a forlorn hope. The Soviets were never unprepared, but orders were orders. Hartmann checked his equipment one final time. Rifle loaded. 4 grenades. 30 rounds of ammunition in his pouches. A bayonet he'd never used but carried anyway. A spade that had proven more useful as a weapon than as an entrenching tool. These were the tools of his trade now, the instruments of survival in a place where nothing mattered except the next minute, the next hour, the next attack up an impossible hill. "All squads ready," Wiener called out softly. The Hauptmann stood at the front of the ragged formation, his pistol in hand, his face invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. "We attack in 5 minutes. Remember your training. Stay low. Use all available cover. Support your comrades. For Germany and the Führer dash. For each other," Otto muttered beside Hartmann, so quietly only Hartmann could hear. "We fight for each other now. Nothing else makes sense anymore." And Hartmann realized his friend was right. The grand ideology, the promises of victory, the certainty of German superiority, all of it had crumbled in the ruins of Stalingrad. What remained was simpler and somehow more profound, men fighting beside men, because that was all they had left. The whistle blew. Hartmann began climbing Mamaev Kurgan again, into the darkness, toward the Soviet positions at the summit, knowing that he would probably die on this hill, that they would all probably die on this hill, but climbing anyway because there was nothing else to do. Behind him, the city burned. Before him, the enemy waited. And above him, the hill of death loomed in the darkness, patient and eternal, ready to consume another day's worth of lives in the grinding machine that Stalingrad had become. November 19th, 1942. Western outskirts of Stalingrad. 53 days later. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius overnight, and Klaus Hartmann's breath formed ice crystals on the collar of his greatcoat. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from a dead man's uniform because his gloves had disintegrated weeks ago. Frostbite had claimed 2 of his toes. He could feel the dead tissue inside his boots, though the company medic had long since run out of supplies to treat such injuries. They'd never taken Mamaev Kurgan. After 2 weeks of attacks that had cost the company 70% casualties, they'd been pulled back and sent to hold a defensive position in the factory district. Then the factories themselves had become battlegrounds: the Red October steel plant, the Barricady gun factory, the Dzerzhinsky tractor works. Each one a fortress, each one defended room by room, machine by machine, until the buildings were nothing but twisted metal and corpses. Hartmann sat in what had been a foreman's office in the tractor factory, his rifle across his knees, staring at nothing. Around him, the 17 survivors of his Company 17, out of the 140 men who'd entered Stalingrad in September, huddled together for warmth. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Otto Beck was dead. He'd died 3 weeks ago, shot through the head by a Soviet sniper while they were clearing a warehouse. Hauptmann Wiener was dead, killed when a Soviet tank had crushed his command post. Lieutenant Kohler was dead, blown apart by a mine. Unteroffizier Richter was dead, bayoneted during a nighttime Soviet counterattack. Nearly everyone was dead. "Did you hear?" someone whispered in the darkness. Hartmann recognized the Voice-Gefreiter man, one of the few surviving originals. "The Russians have broken through. North and south. They've encircled us." Hartmann felt nothing at the news. He was too tired, too cold, too hollow to feel anything anymore. Encircled. It was almost funny. They'd spent 2 months trying to encircle the Soviets in Stalingrad, to trap them against the Volga and annihilate them. And now the tables had turned. "It's a lie," another voice said. Feldwebel Koch, their acting company commander after Wiener's death. "Propaganda. The Führer wouldn't allow it." "I heard it from battalion," man insisted. 2 Soviet armies, maybe 3. They punched through the Romanian lines and linked up west of the city. "The entire 6th Army is cut off." "Then we break out," Koch said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We fight our way through." No one responded. They all knew the truth. The Sixth Army wasn't going anywhere. General Paulus was waiting for orders from Hitler, and Hitler never ordered retreats. They would stay in Stalingrad because that's what the Führer commanded, because retreat was ideologically unacceptable, because admitting defeat was impossible. The irony wasn't lost on Hartmann. They'd mocked the Soviet soldiers for their fanatical refusal to retreat, for their willingness to die in place rather than yield ground. And now the Wehrmacht was doing exactly the same thing, trapped by its own ideology just as surely as by Soviet armies. Outside, the sound of gunfire was constant, not the intense battles of September and October, but the steady, grinding combat of two exhausted armies that couldn't stop fighting because neither side knew how to do anything else. A runner appeared in the doorway, a young Gefreiter whose face was grey with cold and exhaustion. Feldwebel Koch. Orders from battalion. Soviet attack expected at dawn. All units to hold their positions at all costs. Acknowledged, Koch said wearily. Tell battalion we're down to 17 men and less than 100 rounds of ammunition. I'll relay the message, Feldwebel. The runner left. Everyone knew what battalion would say: make do with what you have. No reinforcements were coming. No resupply was coming. They were on their own. Hartmann closed his eyes and thought about home, the farm in Bavaria, green fields and cattle, his mother's kitchen with its warm stove and smell of fresh bread. It seemed like something from another life, another world. Had he ever really been that young man who'd gone off to war expecting glory and adventure? "Klaus," Mann said softly, moving to sit beside him. "Do you remember what we said? Back in September, when we first entered the city? About the Russians being inferior? About them breaking?" "I remember. We were fools." "Yes. They fought harder than any enemy we've ever faced. Harder than the French, harder than the Poles. They turned their city into a fortress and defended every brick of it. And we couldn't break them." Mann's voice was filled with something that might have been wonder or might have been horror. "We threw everything at them, our best troops, our tanks, our artillery, our air force. And they wouldn't break." Hartmann opened his eyes and looked at his comrade. Mann had aged 20 years in 2 months. They all had. "They were fighting for their homes," he said quietly. "We were fighting for, what? Ideology? Territory? The Führer's ambitions? They had something to fight for that mattered more than anything we could offer." "My brother was in France," Mann continued, speaking as if he hadn't heard. "He said the French fought well but knew when they were beaten. They surrendered when continued resistance was pointless. The Russians never did that. Even when we had them surrounded, even when they had no ammunition left, they fought with knives and bare hands. It was like..." He struggled for words. "Like they were willing to accept any sacrifice, any loss, as long as they hurt us in return." "Maybe that's what it takes to stop an army like ours," Hartmann said. "Maybe conventional military logic doesn't apply when you're fighting for survival. When surrender means death anyway, why surrender?" They sat in silence for a while. Outside, snow began to fall, the first real snow of winter, soft and white and utterly indifferent to the suffering of men. In a few weeks, the temperature would drop further. The Volga would freeze. The already desperate supply situation would become catastrophic. The German soldiers who'd mocked Russian farmer soldiers were about to learn what a Russian winter truly meant. Dawn came grey and cold. The Soviet attack materialized out of the snow like an apparition, not a massive assault but a probing attack, designed to identify weak points, to test defenses, to gradually compress the German pocket. Hartmann fired his rifle at shadowy figures moving through the ruins, no longer counting rounds, no longer thinking about ammunition conservation. When he ran out, he'd be finished. That was all. The attack was repulsed, but at a cost. 3 more men from the company were killed. 2 others were wounded badly enough that they couldn't fight. That left 12 effectives. 12 men, out of 140. By afternoon, new orders arrived. Pull back to a secondary defensive line. They were abandoning the tractor factory, abandoning ground they'd paid for with thousands of lives. The Soviets didn't pursue aggressively, they didn't need to. They simply occupied the positions the Germans vacated and waited. Time was on their side now. As Hartmann retreated through the ruins he'd fought for, past buildings he remembered from earlier battles, past positions where friends had died, he felt something fundamental break inside him. Not his courage that had eroded gradually over weeks. Not his discipline that still functioned, still kept him moving and following orders. Something deeper. Some core belief that had sustained him through 3 years of war. The belief that Germany would win. That the Wehrmacht was invincible. That their cause was just and their victory inevitable. All of it was ash now, as dead as Otto Beck, as frozen as his toes, as ruined as Stalingrad itself. Form up, Feldwebel Koch ordered, his voice mechanical. We march to the new positions. Stay together. Watch for snipers. They marched through the snow, 12 hollow-eyed ghosts in tattered uniforms, past the ruins where they'd fought in September when they'd still believed they would take the city in 2 weeks. Past the railway station that had changed hands so many times no one could count. Past Mamaev Kurgan, that hill of death where so many had died for nothing. Soviet soldiers watched them retreat. They didn't cheer or celebrate. They looked as exhausted as the Germans, as hollow, as worn down by the battle. But they were still standing, still fighting, still holding their city. The farmer soldiers the Wehrmacht had mocked. The subhumans who were supposed to break and run. They'd stood their ground and fought the German army to a standstill. That night, in a new position in a different ruin, Hartmann sat with his rifle and thought about what came next. The encirclement was complete, he'd confirmed that from other soldiers. The Sixth Army was trapped, with winter closing in and supplies dwindling. Hitler had promised that the Luftwaffe would supply them by air, but anyone with basic arithmetic could calculate that was impossible. They needed 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver a fraction of that. Which meant they were going to die here. Not in glorious battle, but slowly, from starvation and cold and disease, or in the eventual Soviet assault that would crush the pocket. I used to hate them, Gefreiter said suddenly, sitting in the darkness nearby. The Russians. The propaganda, the training, the ideology, it taught us to see them as less than human. And I believed it. I wanted to believe it. And now I know they're men. Just men. Fighting for their homes, for their families, for their country. The same as us, except. He paused. Except they had better reasons to fight. And that made all the difference. Hartmann nodded slowly. That was the truth that the Wehrmacht had learned in the ruins of Stalingrad, learned through blood and fire and defeat. The Soviet soldiers weren't inferior. They weren't cowards. They were men and women who'd been pushed to the breaking point and had refused to break, who'd found within themselves reserves of courage and determination that had seemed impossible. They'd fought for every building, every room, every staircase, just as the orders from Moscow had demanded. They'd turned the city into a meat grinder that had destroyed the German Sixth Army not through superior tactics or equipment, but through sheer, blood-minded refusal to surrender. And the Germans, for all their training and experience and supposed superiority, had had no answer to that kind of warfare. Do you think we'll surrender? Man asked quietly. When it's hopeless. When there's no food left, no ammunition. I don't know, Hartmann said honestly. Maybe. Or maybe we'll fight to the last, like they did. Maybe we've learned that from them. The snow fell harder, covering the ruins in white, hiding the scars of battle beneath a blanket of cold purity. But beneath that snow, the dead remained German and Soviet alike, thousands upon thousands of them, killed in a battle that would be remembered as one of the bloodiest in human history. Klaus Hartmann pulled his thin coat tighter and stared into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Soviet soldiers were doing the same, preparing for tomorrow's battles, surviving another night in the ruins of their city. The farmer soldiers who had proven themselves to be anything but. The defenders who had shown the Wehrmacht that determination and will could trump training and doctrine. The men and women of Stalingrad, who had fought to the last and would not be broken. And Klaus Hartmann, who had mocked them once, now understood that he and his comrades had been the fools all along.